June 7, 1944. Deep inside a concrete bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler receives the news that will destroy everything he built. But this isn't the story you think you know. This is about the 12 hours that followed, when the most powerful dictator in Europe realized his empire was already dead, and what American intelligence heard him say in those final moments of denial. If you've ever wondered what happens when absolute power meets absolute defeat, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear changes everything we thought we knew about the fall of the Third Reich. The encrypted radio transmission arrived at Bletchley Park at 0300 hours. British code breakers had been monitoring German military channels for 48 hours straight since the Normandy landings began. What they intercepted that morning wasn't tactical communications or troop movements. It was something far more valuable. It was Hitler's voice, recorded during a secure telephone call from the Berghof to Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters in France. The Americans received the decrypted transcript 6 hours later at the Office of Strategic Services in Washington. 23-year-old intelligence analyst Sarah Chen was the first person to read it. She had joined the OSS straight out of Berkeley, one of the few Chinese-American women in the intelligence community. Her hands shook as she translated the German transcription, not because of the military implications, but because of what the words revealed about the man who had set the world on fire. Hitler hadn't raged. He hadn't screamed orders or blamed his generals. In those first hours after learning that Allied forces had successfully established beachheads at Normandy, after being told that the Atlantic Wall had been breached and that American, British, and Canadian troops were pushing inland, Adolf Hitler had laughed. Sarah read the line 3 times to make sure she hadn't mistranslated. "Let them come," Hitler had said, his voice apparently calm, almost amused. "Let the Americans send their shopkeepers and farmers to die on French soil. They have no idea what awaits them. This is exactly what I wanted." But then came the second part of the transcript, the part that made Sarah immediately call her supervisor. After a long pause in the recording, Hitler's voice had changed. The laughter stopped. What followed was a single sentence, spoken so quietly the microphones barely caught it. "If they've already taken the beaches, then we've already lost the war." The silence that followed lasted 14 seconds. Then Hitler disconnected the call. Sarah's supervisor, Major William Harding, read the transcript in his office while Sarah stood at attention. Harding was a West Point graduate who had served in World War I and knew the weight of intelligence that could shift entire campaigns. He set the paper down and looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Chen, what you're holding is either the most important intelligence of the war, or it's disinformation designed to make us complacent," Harding said. "We need to figure out which one it is, and we have maybe 48 hours to do it." "Sir, the encryption patterns match previous verified intercepts," Sarah replied. The voice analysis team confirmed it's Hitler's vocal signature. "This is real." Harding nodded slowly. "That's what worries me. If Hitler genuinely believes that war is lost after just 1 day of the invasion, why is he still fighting? What's he planning?" That question launched the most intensive intelligence operation of Sarah Chen's career. For the next week, she barely slept. Every intercept, every decoded message, every scrap of intelligence that came through Bletchley Park was analyzed for signs of what Hitler meant by those words. Was he preparing a secret weapon, planning a tactical withdrawal to fortify Germany itself? Or was something else happening, something the Allies hadn't anticipated? The answer came from an unlikely source. A German officer named Klaus Weber had been captured near Cannes 3 days after D-Day. Weber was a communications specialist who had worked directly with the High Command. During his interrogation by American intelligence officers, he revealed something that changed the entire understanding of Hitler's psychological state. The Führer stopped sleeping after Stalingrad, Weber told his interrogators. By the time of the Normandy invasion, he was taking dozens of medications daily. His personal physician, Dr. Morrell, had him on a cocktail of amphetamines, opiates, and experimental drugs. Hitler would go days without rest, then crash for 16 hours. His decision-making became erratic. He would issue orders, then countermand them hours later. He trusted no one. But then Weber said something that made the interrogators lean forward. On June 6th, when the first reports of the invasion came in, Hitler was asleep. His staff was terrified to wake him. They waited 6 hours before finally telling him that the Allies had landed. By then, the opportunity to launch an immediate counterattack with reserve forces had passed. When Hitler finally woke up and learned what had happened, he went completely silent. He walked to the window of his room and stared out at the mountains for 20 minutes without saying a word. The interrogation report reached Sarah's desk the same day. She cross-referenced it with the intercepted phone call. The timeline matched perfectly. Hitler's call to Rommel had occurred exactly 90 minutes after Weber claimed. Hitler had been informed of the invasion. Sarah began building a psychological profile, something the OSS had never attempted before with an enemy leader. She compiled every intercepted communication, every report from spies inside Germany, every observation from defectors. What emerged was a portrait of a man whose grip on reality had been fracturing for years. Hitler had built his entire identity around the idea of German invincibility. He had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Denmark, Norway. He had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, but then came the failures, Stalingrad, North Africa, the Battle of the Atlantic. Each defeat chipped away at the mythology he had constructed. By June 1944, Hitler was maintaining the illusion of confidence through sheer force of will and chemical assistance. The D-Day landings shattered that illusion completely. For the first time, Hitler faced undeniable proof that he could not prevent the Allies from bringing the full weight of their industrial power directly onto European soil. The Atlantic Wall, which he had claimed was impregnable, had been breached in hours. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had been swept from the skies. The Kriegsmarine had been unable to prevent the largest amphibious invasion in history. Sarah's analysis concluded that Hitler's quiet statement, "We've already lost the war," represented a moment of absolute clarity breaking through years of self-deception. But the truly terrifying implication was what came after that clarity. If Hitler knew the war was lost, what would he do with the time he had left? The answer began revealing itself through a series of intercepted orders over the following weeks. Hitler issued commands for scorched earth policies across occupied territories. He demanded that German cities fight to the last civilian. He authorized increasingly desperate military operations that had no strategic value but guaranteed massive casualties. Most chillingly, he accelerated programs that served no military purpose whatsoever, programs focused solely on extermination and destruction. Sarah brought her findings to Major Harding in mid-July. "Sir, I think Hitler's statement about losing the war wasn't surrender. It was permission. Permission to stop caring about winning and start focusing on causing maximum damage before the end." Harding studied the evidence she had compiled. "You're saying he's transitioned from trying to win to trying to make the world pay for his defeat?" "Exactly. Every order since D-Day has been about destruction, not victory. He's not planning a comeback. He's planning to take as much down with him as possible. This intelligence reached the highest levels of Allied command. Eisenhower read Sarah's report and immediately understood its implications for the campaign ahead. If Hitler was no longer fighting to win, but fighting to inflict maximum carnage, then every German unit would fight with fanatical intensity, not out of hope, but out of nihilistic fury. The prediction proved horrifyingly accurate. The Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, Hitler's last major offensive, wasn't designed to achieve strategic victory. Intelligence intercepts revealed it was meant to create one final spectacle of German military power, one last chance to inflict mass American casualties. When it failed, Hitler's response was to order the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure. If he couldn't rule Germany, no one would inherit anything but ruins. But Sarah Chun's analysis had another component that took months longer to verify. She believed that Hitler's moment of clarity on June 7th lasted only briefly before his mind retreated back into fantasy. The chemical fog of medications, the isolation of his bunker, the sycophantic reports from his remaining loyalists, all of it allowed Hitler to reconvince himself that victory was still possible through wonder weapons, through American war weariness, through some miraculous reversal of fortune. The evidence came from a German stenographer named Gerda Hoffmann, who was present in Hitler's bunker during the final months of the war. Hoffmann kept detailed notes that were recovered after Berlin's fall. Her accounts described Hitler alternating between moments of lucidity where he acknowledged defeat and hours-long rants about imminent victory. In one particularly disturbing entry from March 1940, with Soviet forces on the outskirts of Berlin, Hitler apparently declared that the Normandy invasion had been successfully repelled and that German forces were advancing on all fronts. Sarah was promoted to captain in early 1945, transferred to Europe as part of the team preparing for post-war intelligence operations. She was in Paris when news arrived that Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. The Reich he had proclaimed would last 1,000 years had elapsed after 12. The final piece of Sarah's investigation during the initial interrogations of Hitler's surviving staff. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, provided the most complete account of Hitler's psychological state during the war's final year. Speer confirmed that Hitler had indeed experienced a moment of genuine recognition that the war was lost after D-Day, but that this recognition had been incompatible with his entire worldview. He could not accept that he had been wrong, Speer told his interrogators. To admit defeat meant admitting that everything he believed, everything he had built, was based on delusion. So instead, he retreated further into fantasy. By the end, he was moving non-existent armies on maps, issuing orders to units that had been destroyed weeks earlier, convinced that victory was imminent. The moment of truth after Normandy, that brief window where he understood reality, closed almost immediately. He spent the rest of the war running from that truth. Sarah Chen compiled her final report in June 1945, exactly 1 year after the intercepted phone call that had started her investigation. Her conclusions were classified top secret and wouldn't be fully declassified until decades later. But her analysis established a crucial understanding of how authoritarian leaders respond to undeniable defeat, how the psychology of absolute power can create fatal blind spots, and how a moment of clarity can be overwhelmed by the weight of ideology and ego. Her report also noted something that many historians would later overlook. Hitler's realization that the war was lost after D-Day didn't lead to attempts at negotiated peace. It didn't lead to efforts to minimize casualties or preserve what remained of Germany. Instead, it led to escalation, to increased brutality, to a determination to make the world suffer for his failure. The moment he understood defeat was inevitable, Hitler stopped fighting for Germany, started fighting against reality itself. American soldiers who fought across Europe in the months after D-Day faced an enemy simultaneously defeated and more dangerous than ever. They were fighting men commanded by a leader who had glimpsed the truth of his situation and then deliberately chosen to ignore it, who had decided that if he couldn't win, he would at least guarantee that everyone lost. Sarah's work remained largely unknown outside classified intelligence circles for decades. She continued working for what became the CIA after the war, specializing in psychological analysis of foreign leaders. But she never forgot that intercepted phone call, those quiet words spoken in a moment of unwanted clarity. If they've already taken the beaches, then we've already lost the war. In 1992, at age 71, Sarah Chen finally spoke publicly about her wartime intelligence work during an interview for a university oral history project. By then, the Cold War had ended, and many documents had been declassified. She was asked about the most significant intelligence she had ever analyzed. "People always want to know about secret weapons or invasion plans," she said. But the most important intelligence isn't always about capabilities. Sometimes it's about understanding how people think, especially leaders under extreme pressure. Hitler's phone call after D-Day wasn't valuable because it revealed military secrets. It was valuable because it revealed that even he knew the truth, even if only for a moment. The tragedy is that he chose fantasy over reality, and millions more died because of that choice. Interviewer asked if she believed Hitler could have ended the war earlier if he had acted on that moment of clarity. Sarah was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think about that a lot." June 7th, 1944. If Hitler had accepted reality in that moment, if he had sought armistice, millions of lives could have been saved. The Holocaust could have been halted months earlier. Cities wouldn't have been reduced to rubble. Soldiers wouldn't have died in pointless battles. But accepting reality would have required him to accept that he was wrong, that his entire ideology was wrong, that everything he had done was wrong. For someone who had built his identity around being infallible, that was impossible. So instead, he chose to drag millions down with him. "Do you think that moment haunted him?" the interviewer asked. "I think it terrified him so much that he spent every remaining day of his life running from it." Sarah replied, "The historical significance of Hitler's reaction to D-Day's success extends beyond the immediate military implications. It represents a case study in how authoritarian psychology responds to undeniable failure. Intelligence agencies still study Sarah Chen's analysis as a model for understanding how leaders with absolute power process defeat. The pattern has repeated throughout history: the initial shock of recognition, the brief window of clarity, followed by retreat into increasingly desperate denial and escalating violence. But there's another dimension to this story that Sarah discovered in her later years. After decades of reflection, the American soldiers who landed on Normandy Beach on June 6th didn't know they were participating in the psychological breaking of Adolf Hitler. They didn't know that their success in those first 24 hours would trigger a moment of clarity in their enemy's mind that revealed the entire war's outcome. They simply knew they had a job to do, and they did it with courage that bordered on the incomprehensible. Sarah interviewed several DAD veterans in the 1980s. After her intelligence work was partially she wanted to understand what those men thought they were accomplishing in those desperate hours on the beach. One veteran, a former sergeant named Robert Morrison, who had landed with the first wave at Omaha Beach, told her something she never forgot. "We didn't think we were breaking Hitler's mind," Morrison said. "We thought we were trying to survive long enough to get off that beach. But looking back now, knowing what you've told me about his reaction, it makes what we did feel even more important. Every yard we gained, every bunker we took, every minute we held that ground, it was all proof that his propaganda was lies. We were shopkeepers and farmers, like he said, and we beat his professional army. That must have destroyed something inside him." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Hitler had dismissed American soldiers as inferior, untrained, undisciplined. Yet it was precisely those American soldiers, many of them drafted civilians, who delivered the psychological blow that Hitler never recovered from. The very men he had underestimated proved his entire worldview was built on delusion. The story of what Hitler said when he learned D-Day had succeeded is ultimately a story about truth and its consequences. For one brief moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his plans, Adolf Hitler confronted the truth about his situation and his ideology. But truth was more terrifying to him than death, so he chose to retreat back into the comfortable darkness of his delusions. That choice cost millions of additional lives, and guaranteed his legacy would be one of absolute catastrophic failure, rather than merely military defeat. Sarah Chen died in 2003 at age 82. Her classified reports had been fully declassified by then, and military historians recognized her work as groundbreaking in the field of intelligence psychological analysis. But she always maintained that the most important lesson from her investigation wasn't about Hitler specifically. It was about the danger of leaders who cannot admit they're wrong, who would rather destroy everything than face reality. In her final interview, conducted just months before her death, Sarah was asked what she would want people to remember about her work on the Hitler intercepts. "I want them to remember that truth always wins eventually," she said. Hitler could run from reality for 11 more months, but reality caught up with him in that bunker in Berlin. The question is how many people have to die while leaders run from truth. That's why intelligence work matters. That's why analyzing how leaders think matters. Because if we understand the psychology of denial and ego, maybe we can recognize it earlier next time. Maybe we can stop the next person who chooses fantasy over reality before they drag the world into catastrophe. The intercepted phone call from June 7, 1944, remains in classified archives, though transcripts are now publicly available. The 14-second pause after Hitler admitted the war was lost still stands as one of the most historically significant silences ever recorded. In that pause, the entire future of the war was decided, not by strategy or weapons or tactics, but by one man's inability to live with truth. For the American soldiers who fought across Europe from Normandy to Berlin, Hitler's internal psychological collapse was irrelevant to their daily reality. They faced determined resistance, deadly weapons, and fanatical defense every step of the way. But historians now understand that they were fighting an enemy whose leader had already accepted defeat, but was too broken to act on that knowledge. Every battle after D-Day was Hitler fighting against his own moment of clarity. The final twist in Sarah Chen's investigation came in 1998, when previously unknown audio recordings from Hitler's bunker were discovered in Russian archives. Among them was a recording from April 29, 1945, the day before Hitler's suicide. In it, Hitler can be heard speaking to a small group of remaining staff members. The audio quality is poor, but one section is clearly audible. "I knew after Normandy," Hitler says, his voice weak and trembling. "I knew then. Everything after was just postponement of the inevitable. But I could not say it. To say it would make it real. So I said nothing, and here we are." Sarah heard this recording during a consultation visit to a research institute. She was 78 years old, nearly blind, using a wheelchair. When the recording finished, the researchers asked for her reaction. "He remembered," she said quietly. "After all those months of fantasy and denial, at the very end, he remembered that moment of truth. He carried it with him the whole time. That's the worst part. He knew, and he chose this anyway." The research team asked if this changed her analysis of Hitler's psychological state. "It makes it worse," Sarah replied. "I thought maybe he genuinely convinced himself the war could be won, that the drugs and isolation had created a complete break from reality. But this recording suggests he always knew, deep down. He was lying to everyone, including himself, but some part of him never forgot that moment on June 7th when he saw the truth. That means all the death, all the destruction that came after, was conscious choice disguised as delusion. That's infinitely more evil." This final revelation added a darker dimension to Sarah's life work. The question shifted from could Hitler have ended the war if he accepted reality, to why did Hitler choose to continue the war when he knew it was lost? The answer touches on the deepest aspects of authoritarian psychology. The need to be right becomes more important than the need to preserve life, including one's own. The American experience in World War II is often framed around industrial might, strategic brilliance, and soldier courage. All of those elements were crucial, but Sarah Chen's intelligence work revealed another dimension. The Americans won because their enemy's leader was psychologically incapable of responding rationally to defeat. Hitler's moment of clarity after D-Day should have led to Instead, it led to nihilistic fury. The Allies won the war not just through superior force, but because they faced an enemy whose leader would rather destroy everything than admit error. For the men who stormed Normandy Beach, this psychological context was unknown and irrelevant. They faced machine gun fire, artillery, mines, and determined defenders. They fought and bled and died, not knowing that their success in those first hours had already accomplished something perhaps as important as the physical beachhead. They had forced Hitler to confront a truth he would spend the rest of his life running from. The legacy of June 7th, 1944, is complex. It's celebrated as the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, which it certainly was. But Sarah Chen's work reveals it was also the moment when Hitler's psychology shifted from fighting for victory to fighting against reality itself. Understanding that shift helps explain why the European war continued for 11 more months of intensive combat, when the outcome was already determined. There's a broader lesson here about leadership, power, and truth. Leaders who surround themselves with yes-men, who punish dissent, who believe their own propaganda, create conditions where they cannot process reality when it contradicts their worldview. Hitler's moment of clarity after D-Day was brief precisely because he had spent years building mental structures designed to reject uncomfortable truths. When truth finally broke through those structures, the cognitive dissonance was so severe that his mind immediately began reconstructing the protective barriers of denial. Sarah Chen spent 50 years studying this phenomenon across different contexts and different leaders. Her work influenced how intelligence agencies analyze foreign leadership psychology. But she always came back to that intercepted phone call from June 7, 1944, as the clearest example of truth breaking through ego and the catastrophic consequences when ego ultimately wins. In her final published paper, written in 2002, Sarah concluded, the 14-second pause after Hitler admitted the war was lost represents the sound of a human mind confronting absolute failure of its core beliefs. In that silence, he faced the choice between accepting reality and changing course, or rejecting reality and doubling down on delusion. He chose delusion. That choice is the reason the European war lasted nearly another year. That choice is why millions more died. We cannot prevent leaders from being wrong. But perhaps, if we understand the psychology of how leaders respond to being wrong, we can create systems and cultures that make choosing reality over fantasy more likely. That's the only way to honor the memory of those who died because one man couldn't admit he was wrong. The story of what Hitler said when he learned D-Day had succeeded is ultimately a story about the consequences of unchecked power meeting undeniable reality. For one brief moment, reality won, but power had 11 more months to inflict suffering before reality's final victory in a Berlin bunker. The American soldiers who made D-Day successful broke more than the Atlantic War that day. They broke the psychological foundation of Hitler's Reich. Everything that followed was the sound of that foundation crumbling, taking millions of lives with it as it fell. The question that haunted Sarah Chen until her death, the question that should haunt all of us, is simple but profound. How many lives could be saved if leaders were capable of accepting when they're wrong? June 7th, 1944. Adolf Hitler admitted the war was lost, then spent the rest of his life pretending he hadn't said it. The world paid for that pretense in blood and fire and ash. The men who landed on Normandy beach changed history not just through their courage, but through forcing a moment of truth that their enemy lacked the capacity to accept. That's the real story of D-Day's success. Not just the military victory, but the psychological defeat of a dictator who understood he had lost but chose fantasy over surrender, ego over mercy, and revenge over wisdom. The Allies ultimately won not because they were stronger than Hitler, but because they were saner than him. In the end, reality always wins. The only question is how many people have to die before delusion finally collapses under the weight of truth.